Howdy, folks. Welcome to the November edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Glad to be your host. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the historic cattle trails. Showcase is brought to you by the International Chisholm Trail Association, of which Dennis Katzenmeyer is president, Michael Grauer is vice president, Nancy Lawrence is secretary, and Mary Lou Rivers is treasurer. And Lonnie Steben is our showcase chair. So got to see many of you at the Western Trail Conference in Dodge City last week, but not everyone. How many people were at the conference here? So a number, but not all of us. In my view, it was the best ever. And huge thanks to everybody who helped make it a success, many people on this call. In a minute, I'm going to ask Michael to share any reflections he might have about the conference. And then we'll have the opportunity to view a video that was referenced at the conference, but we didn't have a chance to see at the time. It's called 24 Hours with the Herd, and it depicts daily life on the cattle drives. Michael Grauer is narrator of the video, and he's also president of the Western Cattle Trail Association. So, Michael, what can you tell us about the conference and before we view the video?
Well, as I think I said this at Dodge City, thank you for everybody for being here and also for those who attended in Dodge. I've been going to that conference in one form or another since 2016. And it was by far the most robust I've ever seen. And especially bringing in representatives of multiple cattle trails, historic cattle trails, was very gratifying to me because when we're all working together, pulling the same wagon, we're going to get where we want to go a lot faster and certainly more efficiently. So it was great to see the enthusiasm for this history and especially the passion. And I think the passion leaked out all over the room from both attendees and presenters, and especially the people of Dodge City, the CVB, the Chamber. Those who were there in Dodge City helped put together, as Nancy was saying, terrific gift bags. The arms were wide open and embraced everybody in a really wonderful way. And especially, and I have to call her out one more time, Mary Hendricks, who was really the point person for everything out there. And then the great staff there at the Boot Hill Museum who opened their doors and their new variety theater facility that was terrific. We had the first conference I went to in 2016 at Casey's Restaurant, and having it in an institution like Boot Hill really raised the bar considerably. And so Lynn Johnson, who's the director of the Boot Hill Museum, Keith Wonder, who's the curator, Kathy Bell, who is the retired curator, they were all there and in support. And of course, representatives not only of the cattle trails, but also Santa Fe Trail Association were in attendance too, because they understand about those intersection points and how that affected this history. So all in all, it was a grand slam of a grand slam, frankly. So, I just want to thank everybody again for being there.
I appreciate it. And I think Mike King is another one that's worthy of mention.
Oh, absolutely.
The work he did on the website and his podcasts is phenomenal. And I would like to hear from Mike, Lonnie, maybe at a future showcase, if I may. Okay. But yeah, Michael, let's go into 24 Hours with the Herd.
Okay, so I gave a presentation called Art of the Cattle Trails, and one segment, which is about a little under 20 minutes long, was a reconstruction on a small scale of Texas artist Frank Ray's 24 Hours with the Herd, something he worked on his entire life and debuted in Dallas in 1933. And it's really a performance art piece because it's 7 paintings, each of which was set on an easel on stage in sequence, with prose written by Clyde Walton Hill, and the musical accompaniment was written by David Guillon with suggestions by Mr. Ray, which included not only trail songs, but also classical music. Now, what we're going to see today is not the actual way they did it, but the way this was constructed for an exhibition at the San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts in San Angelo, Texas. I want to say about 2018 or 2019. You can go back and look that up. And for full disclosure, I've been working on this artist, Frank Ray, spelled Reaugh, since about 1985 or so. Published a biography on him in 2016. And if you're interested, you can find it. It's called Rounded Up in Glory. Mr. Reaugh came from Southern Illinois, which was a great cattle gathering place for herds coming from the West, and then moved with his family by wagon down what was called the Texas Road or the Texas Immigrant Road going south, but it was called the Shawnee Trail going north when it had cattle on it. So he came down and experienced longhorn cattle in Southern Illinois and eventually saw them as he came down through Missouri, Arkansas, down through a little nip of southeastern Kansas, and then settled with his family in Kaufman County, which is east of Dallas. Mr. Reaugh started painting longhorns almost immediately, which he called Texas cattle. He always called them Texas cattle. And they had family oxen, and he took measurements of them and all kinds of different things, sketched them, and started sketching out in what he called Western Texas in 1883, right on the edge of the Western Cattle Trail. So what I'm going to show is, and this is narrated by me at the request of the San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts. I read the prose. The music is not completely accurate, and if you want to see a performance of the whole deal, which is much, much longer. I believe the Austin Symphony did a version of 24 Hours with the Herd in 2016. I think that's online. But I'm going to show you a synthesized version, let's call it, or a very much encapsulated version. And I'll be ready for questions at the end. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Whoop. There it is. And I hope everybody can hear it. So here we go.
This series of paintings was suggested by a brief article published many years ago in the magazine Outing, written evidently by an experienced cowman. They are reminiscent of my first trips to the Western Plains in the early 80s, when it was still a free grass country. There were a few scattered ranch houses, or rather range headquarters, with perhaps a corral or two nearby, but the range was open. The water holes were free for all, and the several trails that wound northward, the Chisholm Trail and others less famous, swung this way or that to reach water or a good crossing, but were not cut or diverted by lines of wire fence. The barbed wire had not come yet, nor the nester, nor the sheep. Much of my exceptional opportunity to sketch and study the West and the range life of those early days I owe to the brothers Frank and Romeo Houston. They were cousins, I believe, of General Sam Houston. Frank Houston was a beef cattle man and handled several 100,000 head of cattle annually. His activities covered the state, but withal, he had ever an appreciative eye for the beauty and romance of it. Romeo Houston, much younger, was a college man with a flair for natural science. He knew from observation, books, and Indian lore the flowers and the animal life of the West, and he was the most skillful cowboy I ever knew. I like to think back to the days I spent with those two men. Driving the herd. The rocky hilltops are capped with shin oaks. Down on the creek, a few cottonwood and hackberries grow. Occasionally there is a feathery mesquite, but for the most part the miles and miles of rolling prairie are covered only with a sparse growth of brownish-gray bunch grass and golden-yellow curly mesquite. Often the pink soil shows through. On level stretches is a hint of mirage, and on the far horizon a butte is pale and blue against the sky. All of it shimmers and glows opalescent under the intense light of the midday sun. Along the side of a wide valley, coulee, almost a canyon, dug deep from the prairie's surface by uncounted centuries of rare but torrential rains, winds the dusty, much-worn trail. Along it for half a mile before us extends a motley mass of varied color, red and yellow, black, brown, and white, like an inland, slowly moving flood with surface of bobbing horns and swaying shoulders and lashing tails. Among them everywhere rise tributary streams of hazy dust, merging about to form the great dust cloud that rolls northwestward. Along the edges of the herd ride at intervals the brown and sinewy cowboys, gay of shirt beneath their open vests and red and blue bandanas and dusty broad-brimmed hats. Often they dart forward on their nimble ponies, throwing back into the herd some restless steer that is broken from the heaving mass, or driving away from the trail cattle native to the range. Far away at the head of the herd rides the boss, scanning with practiced eye the range ahead. At the rear with the remuda of extra mounts ride half a dozen men, keeping well apart, watching the wall of animals before them, calling sharply, now and then, whoopee-tie-yi-yo, to urge on the laggards and weaker steers and stragglers that would stop to graze. The air is heavy with the smell of dust and cattle. The silence of the mighty prairie is broken only by the dust-muffled tread of 10,000 hoofs, making an all-pervading whisper as of wind among leaves. Longhorns rattle as they swing together. There is a creak of saddle leather, while above and over all are the sharp and urgent calls of the cowboys, driving the herd. Watering the herd. What a fountain of bliss is a watering place on the trail. Its waters ripple and sparkle in the sunlight with ever-passing breeze. Its little sandy beaches are bathing places for the birds, and in its shallows the sedges and water weeds, though torn and trampled by many hoofs, are yet the playground for a myriad of bright-winged, darting dragonflies. The water may be muddy, stained with the red of all the west, and hot with all the day's heat from the summer sun, but if only it is sweet and free from gyp, it is well, and like nectar to a thirsty man, horse and cow alike. For a mile the cattle have been hastening, called by the moist, enticing smell of it. Arriving at last at the water's edge, the leaders plunge eagerly in, to be urged onward again and again, till all the mighty herd is in the pool. Knee-deep, belly-deep, or buried to their brown and tawny shoulders in the refreshing waters, their hoofs sunk in the cool sand and ooze of the bottom, they drink, or stand with half-closed eyes, or move to drink and drink again, blissful, greatly content with relief from the hot and dusty trail. Early with the herd, the cowboys have ridden in, and while the ponies drink with muzzle thrust in halfway to their eyes, the equally thirsty men dip and drink from the brim of their Stetson hats. Now, in scattered groups around the pool, they lounge lazily in the saddle or dismount to cool and rest themselves in tired horses, resting but ever watchful, even mindful of duty to the herd. Up on the bank, a mesquite tree with lacy foliage throws a meager shade. A flock of crows, disturbed from their fishing, caw a raucous protest as they fly away to a grove of cottonwoods up the stream. To the left, a low grass-covered hill or mesa cuts the horizon. In the far distance is a mountain, a blue cloud shadow at its base. Over all float the cumulus clouds of a perfect summer day. The trail with its long, hot, weary miles of hardship is forgotten. It is an hour of rest, peace, quiet, while watering the herd. Bedding the herd. It is the end of a long, hot day. Up from the canyon and beaten trail, on ground as level and smooth as may be, the tired cattle are brought to rest. Held loosely, they soon begin to lie down, singly and in little groups at first, then more and more until a few men can hold them while the others ride away to where a thin column of smoke marks the location of cook, chuck wagon, and the night's camp. Here are coffee, sow belly, and lick, and a stack of hot bread mounts high to sink again as the hungry men come in. Nearby, the night horses are picketed, and the men, having eaten, get out their bedrolls, for their night's sleep will be broken by time on guard. Meantime, around the herd ride the men of the first guard, pushing in, perhaps, some straggling steer with soft persuasive curse, shaping the herd and making it compact, for men must ride around it all through the darkest night. The scene is one of peace and wondrous beauty. The sinking sun gilds alike the distant cloud and the present mighty herd with golden glory. The western sky is one vast opal, luminous with tints of pink and purple, gold and olive green, flung high around the nucleus of the departing sun. Soon the colors fade, and the dusk is closing in. Grazing ceases, and slowly and with contented grunts, the last of the herd are dropping to rest. A cow bawls plaintively. From across the herd comes the lulling croon of a cowboy's song. Now, in the dim light, a solitary bull remains standing, his broad head illumined a moment by the dying light of the west. The distant camp grows quiet. An owl hoots in the canyon and is answered by its mate. The great bull looks about him leisurely, then he too sinks to rest. The herd is bedded. Guarding the herd. At midnight, the third guard are awakened, bring in their picketed horses, saddle, mount, and the sound of their tinkling spurs grows fainter and fainter as they ride off to the herd. Two of the men, Bill Stewart and Dan, are old and seasoned cowmen, bronzed of face and bowed of leg by years of saddle life. The other, Jack, is a younger man and only 2 years out on the plains, yet is already efficient and a general favorite, for he is trusty, genial, handsome, and has a beautiful tenor voice. Somewhere, like many another cowboy, he was raised in a cultured home. The wanderlust and the lure of the West seized him, and now he is here and rides out with the other men to the sleeping herd. It is a glorious night, the brilliant moon already past the zenith, as the feathery clouds drift across her face, alternately lights and dims again the peaceful scene. Far as the eye can see are huddled forms of sleeping cattle. Here and there a restless steer gets to his feet, stretches, stands a while, and lies down on the other side with a sigh of deep content. Down in the canyon the owl still hoots. Out on the prairie the coyote's call, high, keen staccato, mingles with the deeper note of the great gray wolf. The moonlight, glimmering pale on many polished horns, becomes weird and ghostly in the shadow of a passing cloud. But always the never-ceasing watch goes on as back and forth around the sleeping pilgrims go the guard, themselves at times vague, shadowy forms, not moving silently but singing or humming as they go, that no nervous steer may be startled by an unheralded approach, but rather that the weary herd may be soothed and reassured as on and on the riders sing their lullabies. The cattle are in a strange country, far from their native range, and the now familiar presence of the men gives them a feeling of safety. The voices of Bill Stewart and of Dan are instinctively low and subdued, as from across the herd Jack's silvery tenor wafts beauty into the night as he sings, now perhaps a part of an aria from some opera heard of old, now a college song reminiscent of old chums and happy carefree days, and now a verse of a hymn learned years ago in church or Sunday school back home. Sometimes the mellow notes float as far as the distant camp, bringing to the heart of some listening cowboy wistful memories of other days. 2 o'clock and all's well. The air of advancing night grows crisp and cool. Occasionally there is a stirring of the breeze. A little oftener, perhaps, the cloud shadows sweep across the plain, but the sleeping herd is quiet. Peace and rest are over all, and a great calmness augurs well as back and forth and around and round ride the crooning cowboys, guarding the herd. Stampede in the Canyon. 2:30, and the boys are counting the minutes before calling the cocktail guard that relieves them when a passing cloud causes momentary darkness. A pony stumbled at a badger hole. A slicker becomes loosened, and just at that unfortunate moment, A sudden gust of wind whips it from the cowboy's hand to sail with eerie outspread wings straight at a nervously gazing cow brute. That imp of Satan whirls and, bellowing with terror, promptly charges straight for the very center of the herd. Every wild steer is instantly on his feet. The cowboy's warning shout is too late. The mischief is done. One shiver pulsates through the great huddled mass. Then they are tearing down the coulee as scared cattle only can fly, toward the narrowing break that leads to the still narrower canyon below. Just in front of them are racing the three cowboys with slack rein and active heel. It is a life and death race, and the sharp spurs and riders' voices urge the tough little ponies to their utmost. If they can only keep the lead until the level plains at the mouth of the canyon are reached, the herd can be milled and the stampede stopped. They sweep through the break and into the canyon, where the rock walls tower 400 feet overhead. The trail is rocky underfoot. Pitfalls lie in wait to catch the ponies' flying feet. But the pace must not be slackened. The canyon awakens and roars and protests with all the power of its echoing lungs. The clashing horns and clattering hoofs answer with increased vigor. Woe and swift death are the lot of anything living that falls under this thundering mass. A steer stumbles. The next one crowds him down, and in shorter time than it takes him to fall, the breath is trampled from his body by 100 hammering hoofs, while 1,000 more pelt him into a shapeless mass of hair and blood. "Only a half-mile more, boys, and we're all right," shouts Bill Stewart, and even as he speaks, his pony trips, and horse and rider are buried under the sea of maddened beasts. As Jack, in a moment of sympathy, impulsively draws rein and slackens his pony, the foremost steer butts it to its knees, and they too are lost to sight. So the race goes on, on. The remaining guard, with hat off and coat thrown back, is still at the head of the herd, with lips close drawn and the expectancy of swift death on his face. The keen night air is none too cool for his heated blood, and he welcomes the life it gives his pony. A short half-mile, and as the canyon debouches into the falda and comparatively level ground, the cowboy swings his horse to one side and allows the leading steer to come abreast, when from his leveled pistol he sends a belching stream of fire scarce 3 inches in front of the wild eyes. With a sudden snort and spring, that animal swerves to one side. Quick as lightning, the pistol is there again, and the flashing fire compels him to make a wide circle, and finally turn back into the tail of the herd that is just emerging from the canyon. Close on his heels are the rest of the herd, crowding, bewildered and confused, a wildly whirling maelstrom of milling cattle. Milling cattle. All through the gray morning watch, the one cowboy on weary, trembling horse rides just without the whirling circle of the frantic, milling herd. The mad pace grows slower at last, but it seems long hours before, through the frenzied bellowing and the roar and rattle of hoofs and horn, came the welcome shouts of other men. Then he can withdraw a little to one side and rest his drooping horse. The soft, sweet breath of dawn sweeps over the western plains. The prairie sparrow twitters sleepy to its mate. The sky grows eloquent of coming day. Long lances of light shoot up to the zenith, and presently the sun breaks through its veil of cloud and glints and glistens on the rocky crowns of the hills and tips with rosy light the mighty dust cloud that rises from the valley. The pace of the milling cattle grows ever slower until at last it is controlled. The milling ceases. The stampede is stopped. Up in the silent canyon, so lately filled with uproarious life, lie 73 dead cattle and 2 horses and cowboys, crushed into unrecognizable shapes. A meadowlark sings. The sparrow's twitter becomes a hymn of ecstasy and praise. The cottonwood trembles and whispers in the morning breeze and breaks into glory in the morning sun. But they in the canyon have passed beyond its narrow limits to the grander heights and fairer plains across the great divide. The herd moves on. It is late forenoon. The plains glow with the light of midday sun. The air quivers with the growing heat. Far as the eye can see, the ground is covered with gray-brown sage grass or the golden yellow of curly mesquite. In the distance, the herd, quieted again, moves on under its canopy of dust. The delayed chuck wagon is still in the rear. Further into the left is a thin gray line of mesquites, and on the far horizon is a low blue range of hills. Back at the canyon, quiet settles over the plain. A meadowlark sings. Overhead, turkey buzzards are circling. A coyote slinks down from the brakes. Down in the canyon at the heads of new graves are two flat rocks, and in uncertain letters rudely carved with a cowboy's knife, on one is Bill Stewart, and on the other, Jack. In the left foreground of the picture, a lone cowboy is riding to overtake the outfit. Yesterday's work is ended. Another day's work has begun as the herd moves on.
Well, there you have it. It was Mr. Ray's, as I said, it was the culmination of a very long career. It was 50 years leading up to that when he started putting together this performance art piece rather. And it was really met with a great deal of enthusiasm, but he showed it in Dallas and showed it at various places, as you saw. And I mentioned, it's mentioned in the clip that he showed it at the Texas Centennial Exposition. What's not mentioned, unfortunately, is that Mr. Ray hoped to show 24 Hours with the Herd, the whole series, at the Texas Centennial Exposition in Dallas, which was the center. Even though there were other fairs across the state, it was considered the Dallas World's Fair at that time. Unfortunately, he was not included in any of the art exhibitions, nor did his proposal to show 24 Hours in what was called the Texas Ranger Building there. He was declined, and so he had to apply for a vendor's license, along with the cotton candy salesman and the hot dog salesman. And he set up under a canvas tent the performing of 24 Hours with the Herd next to the livestock pavilion, which is poetic on one level, but it's not exactly the way you would show art objects. So Dallas at that time, even though he'd lived there since 1890, had turned its back on him. And it was only in Fort Worth that he was invited to show his work at the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial Exposition held the same year, which really the Fort Worth show focused on Western art. Mr. Ray really tried to stay loyal to Dallas, but after this, he looked for other places for his collection to ultimately go, including 24 Hours. He had originally intended for it to stay in Dallas and built a studio in what was then Oak Cliff across the Trinity River. But he felt spurned and eventually donated that collection to the University of Texas with the understanding that they would build a museum building to house the Frank Ray collection called Paintings of the Southwest, which he wanted to share with, as he called it, the children of the Southwest. I don't know if any of you have visited the University of Texas at Austin campus, but you will not find such a museum because he made this donation in 1938. And even before the ink was dry, they were already trying to change the agreement. Eventually, he agreed to allow it to be shown in the old library building where it was shown episodically or periodically, but never consistently as they agreed to. And eventually it was relegated to a basement archive where it, unfortunately, because they're all in pastel, was highly susceptible to mold, and many of them were heavily damaged by mold throughout their lives. And one of his students in many years later had to repaint good big sections of 24 hours. So what we see today in the originals is really about, by my estimation, about half Frank Ray and half by his student, because so much of it had gotten damaged. But they still have a large collection of Mr. Ray's work. A little over 200 exists there at UT that you will see, again, periodically when they pull them out of the basement. But the bulk of his work is at where I used to work, Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas, just south of Amarillo. There are about 1,000 Ray pieces there, including works in color, works in pencil, and then his photographs. His photographs are largely unknown, but really need to be exhibited and published, because he not only was he painting trail drives, he was photographing them. And as far as I know, and I will stand by this statement, he is the only artist in the world who painted trail drives while they were actually happening, not in nostalgic scenes from later on that you could only cobble together in the studio. So Mr. Ray witnessed them. And I said this in Dodge. Initially, he tried to carry his sketching gear on horseback, and a saddled horse. But that didn't work out too well because the horse didn't like all the things that were banging around. So his MO after the first couple of tries was to buy what he called a Studebaker hack, spring wagon, at the Dallas, basically like a used car dealer. He would go to a used wagon dealer and buy a hack, and then he'd buy horses or mules at the stray sale, because strays would get loose and be rounded up and then auctioned every month. And then he'd set out on the trail drive, and there are actually photographs of the Studebaker hack and him out on the trail following the cowboys, and they welcomed him. They really did. He was a little bit of an oddity, but they welcomed him in, and so he continued that and made some spectacular works of art, some of which I showed in the presentation in Dodge. Maybe I could do that again, just art of the cattle trails for you at some other point. But 24 hours with 24 hours with the herd is unique. I've never seen anything else like it. And as I said, the music that San Angelo put in is not what's originally intended. And those published, we know what music was performed, and the prose was written, as you saw, with Mr. Ray and Clyde Walton Hill, who was a poet. And David Guillaume is also credited with one of the compositions for Home on the Range, that the more popular version that we know today. So there's actually a David Guillaume collection. I think it's in Waco. And he always acknowledged his work on 24 Hours with the Herd. So I think it's quite spectacular, and getting to see it, I hadn't seen it all in a few years. And it's really quite remarkable. A couple of things I'll tell you. In the second to the last image, which is milling cattle, you'll notice that the cowboy in the foreground is waving his hat. And if you looked at the top of the mesa, the two riders that are on the mesa are the ghosts of the two men who had been trampled to death. And so they've crossed the Great Divide. I'm sorry, it gets to me every time. It's pretty powerful. And then the herd moves on. Is the last image, and it's pretty critical to understand. And he keeps talking about yellow mesquite. What he's talking about is mesquite grass, not mesquite trees. Mr. Ray was a self-taught zoologist and botanist, and many of his students became collectors of plants, insects, birds. He loved birds, and so that they're always included in anything he did. He really truly was a Renaissance man, and that's the subtitle for my book, is Texas Renaissance Man. So I'll be glad to take questions if anybody has any. Yes, sir, Tom.
Two quick ones. Are the paintings that you showed today in your book?
So my book is a biography. It's not an art book. What I recommend you find is mine is the only really accurate, and I'm not saying this to be immodest, it's just the truth. There's so much mythology about Frank Ray in Texas, particularly. My book is a biography. It's not an art book, but there is a book called Windows on the West, published by UT Press in conjunction with the last time they showed 24 Hours with the Herd, and that was a 2016 UT Press publication. And it has spectacular images of Mr. Ray's work. So I would recommend you get both copies if you want to know more about him. So get Windows on the West and also Rounded Up in Glory. That's what I would do.
Do you have an explanation for why he was rebuffed in so many different places?
Well, Dallas had moved on by that time and wanted to be seen as a progressive city. Ironically, the theme for the Texas Centennial Exposition in Dallas was all about cowboys. And they even brought in Gene Autry to film Cavalcade, one of his best-known films, to film there in Dallas. And all the promotional materials had cowboys and cowgirls and vaqueros and everything. They also included in the brand new Dallas Museum of Fine Arts an exhibition of Frederick Remington's work. So it was, all these things are really ironic. They really it was basically bringing Texas to the world. And they knew that the popularity of the cowboy as image was something they could use and leverage, and they did. However, it was the popular culture cowboy, not the cowhand, not the drover. And what Mr. Ray was presenting was a different story. And so that's the part, and that's why I think this fits so well with what we do with the Cattle Trails Consortium, is we're telling that story, which is the foundation for everything that comes later. Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Yep.
Michael, I have a question or two.
Yes, sir.
Who did you say wrote the prose for that presentation?
A poet named Clyde Walton Hill.
Clyde?
Walton Hill.
That's
And Mr. Ray and Hill wrote it together.
that's beautiful. It was really beautifully written, I thought.
It is.
And also, I might compliment you on the delivery. Quite
Thank
good
you.
also. And what's the name of your book again? Is that Round Up in Glory? Is that?
Rounded Up in Glory. Yes, sir. And it's published by University of North Texas Press, and available by Texas A&M University Press, because the UNT Press is a branch.
Thank you.
And be prepared. It makes a good doorstop because there's lots of words in it. But it's not a picture book. It's a biography. He was really amazing. I mean, when you read it, you'll see he was really amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It's a thing of beauty. That is an absolute work of art, literally and figuratively. The art and the whole production.
Thank you.
See
I'd be
if
curious,
there are
had
other
any
questions.
of you ever seen it before?
Never.
No.
Okay, thank you.
So, Michael, question about there was a reference to a bull in there, and there was a reference to a steer in there. And were these mixed herds? Did it depend? I mean, we've heard on the Western Trail there was breeding stock going north, so obviously that was intact animals. But the typical cattle drive, were they bulls, steers, cows, calves? What do you have?
Well, we heard Bob Canan in Dodge City talk about how on the King Ranch, for example, they had them separated by 2-year-old steers and 3-year-old steers and so on. Most of the trail herds, in my research, were a mix until they honed it down to a science, and particularly the stocker cattle that went up the Western Trail, because what they usually drove north for stocker cattle were breeding cows, heifers, and so on. And then they usually brought in European bulls, Herefords initially, Shorthorns and Durhams initially, and then later on Angus much further down the road. But, and so a typical trail herd would be a mix, dry cows, for example, and they always refer to them as old bulls, perhaps past their breeding prime, because that demand for beef was so great after the Civil War that any beef would do until they realized that Texas Longhorns are kind of stringy, and the beef wasn't really of high quality, but the demand really overtook the supply. And so they round up just about anything. And the other thing, and we mentioned this with the Kreisingers as they talked about it, is this myth that all these Longhorns were, giant horn spreads, 6 and 8 feet. Where in fact, that's not really the case because they're harder to handle. And those are the old ones. I mean, those are, and some of the old bulls were pretty old. Some of the steers were pretty old. And there's another thing. This is also based on my research, and this isn't a term you see used very much today at all. But in those days, they often talked about stags, which are full-grown bulls who had been castrated later in life. You don't hear that very much in common vernacular, but they're also part of this equation too. And Mr. Reaugh, being a zoologist, made a very careful study of all bovines and could, talk intelligently about them separate from his art because he knew them quite well. So he speaks from a place of authority as an observer. So yes, there were cows, there were steers of multiple ages, mostly dry cows now on the beef cattle herd, and they always referred to it that way. This is a beef herd. This is a stocker herd. So I think that's an important distinction we need to remember. That's a great question. Thank you, Ron.
Lonnie?
Well, I was just going to say, you can almost place yourself in that picture when you're with your narration and with the words that go with it.
Thank you.
It's fabulous.
Well, and in today's world, we're so used to immersion, and Mr. Reaugh really obviously is so forward thinking. 100 years before that becomes a popular thing, he truly puts us in the drive, and that's kind of amazing, especially because he was very anti-modern art, at least what he saw coming out as modern art. He felt like he had to make storytelling pictures. As some other artists referred to it. So I appreciate you recognizing that we're actually there. And, I worry when we show this is that it's not fast moving enough for today's audience, but I'm so glad that y'all caught that he really wanted, it was really a you are there kind of approach.
Michael, do you have an explanation for why the Dallas and Fort Worth people preferred the mythological stylized cowboy over the real cowboy?
It puts butts in seats.
Say again?
It puts butts in seats. You sell tickets. And we can go all into them. And I'd love to do that program for you sometime. I give a lecture called "What Cowboys Were Not," and one of the things they were not was gunmen. And we can thank Owen Wister for that because Wister gave the cowboy a girlfriend and a gun. And that's what everyone expects now. And likewise, we need to remember that rodeo is simply the newest iteration of a Wild West show. And especially pro rodeo, and especially things like PBR, that's all about spectacle. That's like watching NASCAR. Everybody watches NASCAR because they want to see a wreck. That's why everybody watches PBR, because they want to see a wreck. If you want to get people to get real honest with you, that's what it's about. And so if you want to see true rodeo back as close as you can, go to see a working ranch cowboy rodeo. Yep. That's where you'll get as close to ranch work, because those guys are still working cowboys. The guys that work pro rodeo today, they pull up in their Ferraris and put on their cowboy clothes and go in and perform, and then they go back and get in their Ferraris and put on their topsiders and go back to their hotel rooms and cash their checks. That's the bottom line. But, this all started in Mexico with charreada, of course, and then it segued into the Wild West shows, and now what we consider rodeo today. It's about selling tickets.
Can you recommend one or two realistic rodeos, working rodeos?
Well, the best, I would go to the Working Ranch Cowboys National World Championships in Amarillo, usually in November. That is something to see. They have a great arena, but any working ranch any WRCA rodeo is worth it. And I'd also recommend any small town rodeo that's not PRC approved, because you never know what you're going to see, because that's much closer to the way those contests really were held. I think the one in I'm having a brain hiccup right here. The one in the Flint Hills, Ron, Jeff.
Well, the Strong City Rodeo, you mean?
Strong
the Flint
City,
Hills
yeah.
Rodeo at Strong City?
Flint Hills. Yeah, that's a spectacular one. Abilene holds a great rodeo.
Yeah, Pretty Prairie has a pretty unique one too.
Right. And so, Phillipsburg also, all good rodeos. Independence has one, and so on. But back in the day, you know, every small town had a rodeo, and it was usually a couple of guys that get together, and you know, they had fairly Greenbroke horses or whatever, and you know, they'd circled a piece of dirt with their pickups and turn the lights on, and that was a rodeo arena. I mean, there's something pure about that. And now, you know, they're covered. Those riders are covered with endorsement patches, just like a NASCAR car. You know, so
Thank you.
you bet.
Other questions
Michael?
for Michael? Frank?
I'd like to ask about some of the geography of the paintings.
Yes, sir.
When those paintings were going by, I saw some high mountain spires, and in the description, I heard about, as part of the stampede, a 400-foot, chasm. Is that at all consistent with what a typical trail drive was?
Okay, I think the thing to remember is that Mr. Ace painting these 50 years after you witnessed this stuff. He traveled all over West Texas, out to Big Bend, out to the Davis Mountains. He was in Paladura Canyon. He'd been to Grand Canyon. And remember, all these artists, these great Western artists who we know, or we want to believe, made accurate paintings of the American West. I mean, all their paintings were composites. You cannot go to a spot that Thomas Moran painted and you'll be disappointed because it doesn't look like the painting. Same thing with Albert Bierstadt, and Ray needs to be part of that because he called himself a landscape and cattle painter, and so a dramatic landscape made the series more dramatic, I think we would all say. And as far as driving cattle through Paladura Canyon, I mean, that would be a challenge, and likewise there were cattlemen in the Big Bend region as well. So most of that was for effect. As far as the happenings in the text and the happenings in anything outside the stage set, frankly, as that's what it was, the stage set of the 400-foot wall canyon, everything else is accurate to what Mr. Ray witnessed. I have a little bit of trouble with firing a 6-shooter in front of a racing steer, but again, by 1933, cowboy movies are dominating the silver screen, and Mr. Ray was subject to that as well as anybody else. So I think it was, in many ways, a synthesis of a lifetime of in painting these dramatic landscapes in the West. And he talks little things like, there's a blue butte in the distance. Well, to us, it looks like a mountain. And we know what Hollywood does when they try to depict Kansas. There's always mountains in the background, and so on. So there's part of that. It's dramatic effect. But yeah, he had been to those places, and he wove those into his tale about a trail drive. Is that a fair answer?
Yep, covers the ground nicely.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Well,
just
yeah,
just a
go ahead.
quick comment, if I could.
Please.
Back to the rodeos. I remember my dad telling me this had be probably mid 1950s. We have some old 8mm movies of a parade in Colorado City, Texas, and here comes the stuff about the rodeos. And I asked my dad, well, how come we quit going to or didn't go to those rodeos? And he said, well, it's not the local guys anymore. It's guys that are kind of the professionals. So I remember that from the mid 1950s that change was underway from the local guys that everybody knew. Dad said, I don't know who these guys are anymore. And so he quit attending the rodeos. Just a comment.
It's an accurate point. It's just like we watch the NFL or Major League Baseball on TV. We don't have a real connection to these people, and the small town rodeos, they still do, because there'll be, a handful of guys that I have a cousin up in Lincoln, Nebraska, or Crete, Nebraska, rather, and he rodeoed forever. He never, he had his PRCA card, but he never made it to the show, as they say. And for every Trevor Brazil, there's 300 guys who want to be Trevor Brazil, and they're still competing. That's the beauty of it, is they're still trying to still trying to capture the West and that cowboy lifestyle in some way or another.
To me, it's the difference between the NFL and my high school football team. You know, I'm passionate about my local kids, but I love watching the NFL perform at the highest level.
Right.
Other questions, Carolyn?
Well, I'm a quiet observer of these meetings in Wichita, and I'm mostly a Cowtown fan, but I learned things, and so I'm pleased to be able to attend. I really appreciated that video. I learned a lot. I was touched, and I loved the prose, and I loved the speaking, the narration. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for doing it. Thank you all for presenting it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Michael, for such a terrific job. Let's give another virtual round of applause to Michael for another terrific performance there. And hats off indeed. Well, thanks. This has been a terrific edition. Lonnie, I think we're working on our next Cattle Trails showcase, so watch for an announcement on that. So our next Cattle Trails showcase would be Friday, December 13th. I think we are going to have some board discussion to follow this recording. But for now, until next time, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thank you for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our Cattle Trails showcase. Happy trails, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Mary, you're going to be able to stay on, I hope?